A synapse is made of 3 regions. The synapse includes the presynaptic knob. The presynaptic knob is the ending of the presynaptic neuron. But the ending of the presynaptic neuron is the presynaptic knob. Okay? And the ending of this neuron has a lot of vesicles that contains neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, they are chemicals that are used to transmit the action potential from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. There are many different neurotransmitters in our bodies. Noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter, glutamine is a neurotransmitter. The most common neurotransmitter, and the one that we are going to talk about, is the acetylcholine. So acetyl is the most present neurotransmitter. The synapse that involves the acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter is known as the cholinergic synapse. So the cholinergic synapse is termed cholinergic synapse because the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So in the presynaptic knob, these are vesicles with acetylcholine containing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And then we have a gap, which is known as the synaptic cleft. And then we have the ending of the postsynaptic neuron. And the plasma membrane of the ending of the postsynaptic neuron has specific protein receptors with binding sites for the neurotransmitters. These are known as chemical gated protein channels. So now the protein channels are so many. We have open hydrophilic protein channels that are always open for the movement by facilitated diffusion. And we have the protein carriers that will change shape when the molecule or the ion binds to the specific binding site and then allows facilitated diffusion. And we have the voltage-gated protein channels that are tightly shut, but they are going to open when the electric potential difference across the membrane changes. And now we have another one, which is the chemical-gated protein channel. So this is a protein channel for diffusion of ions and molecules. It's always shut, and it has a binding site for another chemical. In this case, it has a binding site for the acetylcholine. When the acetylcholine binds with this binding site, it will change the shape of the protein, and the channel starts to open. So these are the chemical-gated protein channels. Okay? And of course, don't forget that all the plasma membrane of all these neurons have sodium-potassium pumps, they have channels for sodium and proteins, and they have voltage-gated channels for sodium and potassium, and they have voltage-gated channels for sodium and potassium. Okay? In addition to that, we have voltage-gated calcium channels on the membrane of the presynaptic knob. Okay? So, the presynaptic neuron, if I am speaking about a reflex arc, the presynaptic neuron could be the sensory neuron, and the postsynaptic can be the relay neuron. The presynaptic would be the relay, and the postsynaptic can be the motor neuron. The presynaptic can be the motor neuron, And the postsynaptic will be the membrane of the muscle. And here the synapse will be known as the neuromuscular junction. That's the synapse between the motor neuron, the endings of the motor neuron, and the muscle. دي هنتكلم عليها next lesson أو اللي هي stimulation of the muscles. Okay? بس in general دلوقتي هنتكلم على السynapse. So action potential is traveling along the membrane of the axon of the presynaptic neuron. It reaches the synaptic knob. It reaches the ending. Yes. Yes. من عند الريسبتور. من أول ما اتعملت الأكشن potential, it's moving. It's being transmitted. It's being conducted till it reaches the synaptic knob, and it's going to depolarize the membrane in this area. The depolarization of the presynaptic membrane will stimulate the voltage-gated calcium protein channels to open. And calcium ions starts to diffuse into the presynaptic knob. The diffusion of the calcium ions in this knob will stimulate the vesicles with the acetylcholine to move towards the plasma membrane and fuse with it. And it starts to release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic knob also has a lot of mitochondria. And this is to release the energy needed for the exocytosis of the acetylcholine here, and to actively pump the calcium ions back out into the synaptic cleft. Yani the calcium ions, they diffuse into the presynaptic knob through the voltage-gated calcium channels when they open, and after they stimulate the movement of the vesicles for the exocytosis, they are pumped out. Okay? When the acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft, the acetylcholine will start to diffuse across the cleft. And it binds to its specific protein receptors on the chemical gated protein channels. Their binding will cause a conformational change in this protein. This causes the channel to open. And these channels are specific for sodium ions. So these chemical gated protein channels, they are sodium ion protein channels. So when they open, sodium ions will start to diffuse in the postsynaptic neuron. In the tissue fluid all around. مش انت عندك sodium, potassium, pumping sodium ions always outside. And as a rule, we know that the concentration of sodium ions outside the neurons is always high. So the sodium ions will start to diffuse into the neuron, and it starts to depolarize this membrane. And the depolarization will open the voltage-gated sodium channels. More channels will open, voltage-gated, and an influx of sodium ions into this area will generate an action potential. Okay? Yes. بيبايند مع البروتين ريسبتورز بتاعته اللي هي موجودة على الشانلز بتاعت الصوديوم. يعني البروتين channel, which is responsible for the diffusion of the sodium ions, has a binding site for the acetylcholine, and these channels are closed. When the acetylcholine binds, the channel opens, and the sodium ions will diffuse into the neuron. So they start to depolarize the membrane. Okay? When the membrane starts to depolarize, the voltage-gated sodium channels will now open, so there will be an influx of sodium ions. So it can generate an action potential. When the action potential reaches the ending of the presynaptic knob, it depolarizes the membrane. and this will stimulate the voltage-gated calcium channels to open. So calcium ions diffuse into the presynaptic knob. It will stimulate vesicles containing acetylcholine to move towards the plasma membrane and fuse with it, releasing the acetylcholine by exocytosis. Then the acetylcholine will diffuse across the cleft and bind to its specific protein receptors on the chemical-gated sodium protein channels. It changes the shape of the protein, causing the channel to open, and sodium ions will diffuse into the postsynaptic neuron, depolarizing its membrane. This stimulates voltage-gated sodium channels to open, and there's an influx of sodium ions to generate an action potential. And this way, the action potential that was in the presynaptic neuron is transmitted to the postsynaptic neuron across the cleft. أول ما الصوديوم اينز بتدخل بالديبولارايز الممبرين. فأول ما الممبرين الإلكتريك بوتنشال ديفرنس بتاعته بتبتدي تقبل less نيجاتيف، يعني مثلا تتحول لحد مثلا نيجاتيف 50 ملي فولتس inside. This stimulates the voltage-gated sodium channels to open عشان يحصل بقى influx of sodium ions، عشان تدخل كمية sodium ions كتيرة تخليها positive 30 أو 40 عشان تبقى action potential. اوكي؟ يعني الديبولاريزيشن اللي بتحصل في الأول لو ما سببتش إن الvoltage-gated sodium channels دي تتفتح مش هيبقى فيه action potential، ده اللي احنا هنتكلم عليه ليه.
يعني هي بتتفتح امتى؟
عند threshold معين هنتكلم
بس هي
عليه.
بتبقى اصلا بتبقى نكتف 65 وبعدين بتبقى نكتف 50 يعني بعد ما اول صوديوم تخش بعدها.
يس لو هي ما وصلتش للنيجاتيف 50 الvoltage-gated channels مش هتفتح.
بس اول بقى ما بيكونوا
يعني النيجاتيف 50 ده انا لسه اصلي ما اتكلمتش على الحته دي. النيجاتيف 50 ملي فولت، يعني انا بقول النيجاتيف 65 ملي فولتس دي اللي هي الريستنج بوتنشال. اوكي؟ النيجاتيف 50 ملي فولتس انسايد دي اللي انا بقول عليها الثريشولد. دي انا لسه ما اتكلمتش عليها. يعني انا علشان الديبولاريزيشن تفتح الفولtage-gated sodium channels to be able to generate an action potential لازم الديبولاريزيشن توصل الالكتريك potential difference at least to negative 50. لو ما وصلتش للنيجاتيف 50 الفولtage-gated sodium channels مش هتفتح، عشان كده بنسميها حاجه اسمها the all or nothing. يعني لو الفولtage-gated channels دي ما اتفتحتش as if there was nothing happened ولا كأن كان في stimulus اصلا. لان there is no generation of action potential. هنتكلم عن الحته يعني just 2 minutes وهبتدي اشرح الحته دي بالتفصيل.
بس
نعم.
ممكن نعمل كده عن اكشن بوتنشال ممكن نعمل ايه؟
ما انا لسه هقولها. بس دلوقتي انا عايزه الحته بتاعت الساينابس دي تكون اتفهمت.
هو ده بيحصل فين؟
الساينابس دي ما بين الاندنجز اوف نيورونز، ما بين السنسوري والريلاي او الريلاي والموتور او الموتور والمسل، نيوروماسكولار جانكشن.
بس هو ايه الكالسيوم؟
الكالسيوم ايونز دي اللي بتستيميوليت الموفمنت اوف ذا فيسيكلز فور اكسوسايتوزس. يعني انت لما الديبولاريزيشن بتوصل للبريساينابتيك ممبرين ده بيستيميوليت الكالسيوم channels to open لانهم they are voltage gated. فالinflux of the calcium ions into the presynaptic knob بيستيميوليت الاكسوسايتوزس of الacetylcholine، بيستيميوليت movement of the vesicles. they release acetylcholine into the cleft by exocytosis. بعد كده الكالسيوم ايونز دي هتبقى pumped out تاني into the cleft. Acetylcholine diffuses across the cleft and it binds with the specific protein receptors, which is part of the chemical-gated sodium ion protein channels. When they bind, they change the shape of the protein, so these channels open, allowing the diffusion of sodium ions into the postsynaptic neuron. This depolarizes the membrane here. If the depolarization was enough to open the voltage-gated sodium channels, there would be an influx of sodium generating an action potential. And the action potential starts to be transmitted.
يسموه على اساس ايه بيبقى فيه؟
هقول لكم دلوقتي.
هو كمان الريت بروتين شانلز بتتقال على الكاريرز وال
Yes.
الحاجات بتبقى مقفولة دايما يعني؟
يس لا مش كل الحاجات المقفوله are chemical gated. هنا علشان it opens by the binding of a different chemical.
بس هو ايه معنى depolarization؟ يعني
بتغير ال resting potential. It make it less negative.
بس دي ده اللي هو دي صوديوم.
Yes. Okay. There is an enzyme in the synaptic cleft known as acetylcholine esterase enzyme. This enzyme breaks down acetylcholine. And after all this happens, the acetylcholine esterase enzyme will break down the acetylcholine for two reasons. عشان يبتدي يحصل recycling, it breaks it down into acetate and choline. عشان يبدأ يحصل recycling and formation of new acetylcholine in the presynaptic knob. وعلشان الacetylcholine, if it accumulates in the synaptic cleft, there will be continuous firing of action potential. And if this acetylcholine remains binding to its protein receptors, these channels will remain open, so action potential will not stop in the postsynaptic neuron. There will be there will be continuous firing of action potential. It will not stop. عشان كده this acetylcholine esterase enzyme is very important in the cleft. Okay?
بيبقى فين بالظبط؟
في الكلeft.
بس ايه اللي بيخليه اصلا يطلع كده عشان يكسر يعني امتى بيطلع يعني؟
هو على طول موجود.
هو ايه اللي بيخليه بيكسر الاسيتايلكولين؟
عنده specific shape of active site. They bind together.
لا يعني قصدي
They collide.
الاسيتايلكولين بيطلع عشان الصوديوم كده يخش الناحيه الثانيه فبيعمل اكشن بوتنشال بس امتى بقى ما هو يعني مش ده بيبقى بيحصل عشان انا مثلا اتعامل معاه او كده امتى بقى
معلش امتى؟ ما كل حاجه بتطلع في وقت. يعني احنا في حته في المنهج بتاعنا اللي هي اسمها transcription factors اللي هي الكنترول بتاع الجينز. امتى الجين هيبقى اكسبريس؟ امتى الجين هيحصل له ترانسكريبشن وترانسليشن؟ امتى بقى الانزيم ده يتعمل؟ يعني احنا مش هناخدها على الانزيم ده بالذات، بس في كونديشنز بتحصل وتغيرات معينه بتحصل في السيل وفي السراوندينج بتاع السيل that can stimulate specific genes to start to be transcribed. فيبتدي البروتين بتاعها يتعمل. We're going to take it through genetics. Okay? عامة عشان قبل ما ننقل عند الساينابس is very important. The synapse has a lot of rules. One of the main rules of the synapse is that it allows a one-way transmission of action potential. So action potential will always be moving in one direction. It will move from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic. It will never go back. Okay? And the synapse allow this to happen because the vesicles containing the acetylcholine is always in the presynaptic. And the protein receptors for the acetylcholine are always on the postsynaptic. The synapse is involved in memory and learning. The synapse, how it's involved in memory and learning exactly up till now is not 100% known. بس الidea اللي موجودة in due to the formation of new synapses all the time, new synapses are being made, and the formation of new nerve pathways. For example, the synapse is always, if your synapse is always receiving, or if the brain is always receiving two informations at the same time. For example, you are all the time receiving information coming from your ear with my voice, and information coming from your eye with my picture. Okay? So the brain is always receiving those two information together all the time. So it starts to form a new synapse and the pathway for those two neurons together to store this information. So whenever you're going to hear my voice, even without seeing me, you'll know that this is me. This is how you could recognize the voice of someone speaking to you on the phone. Whenever you hear this voice, you're going to vision, this is that person. So this is how it's involved in memory and learning. At the same time, the synapse will allow filtering out of low-level stimuli because the brain is receiving so many information at the same time. And a lot of this information are sensory informations. Okay? So, علشان ما يحصلش overloading to all these sensory informations in the brain, there is something known as the all or nothing. It's going to filter out low-level stimuli. زي ما احنا بنتكلم دلوقتي على stimulus and how it generates action potential. You will understand that for the stimulus to be able to generate an action potential, the depolarization that happens at the start has to reach a certain level for the action potential to happen. So when all the information is reaching the synapse, only the ones that are able to reach a certain threshold will be able to cross the synapse and cause an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron.